Hi. Tonight we're talking about the Shedim. And this is one of those episodes where if you make one wrong move at the beginning, the whole thing is cooked. Because the easy move is to say, oh, Shedim just means demons. And then immediately replace a very Jewish, very textured, and very historically layered category with a flattened, modern pop culture image. Horns, hellfire, possession movie. That would be lazy. It would also be wrong, or at least wrong enough to make everything that follows less interesting. So the goal tonight is not to reduce the Shedim to a stock monster. My goal is to walk carefully through the sources and, I guess, let them stay as strange as they are. Because to me, what makes the Shedim compelling is, of course, they're frightening, but it's that they exist exactly where some of the other oldest traditions put the unseen, between like religion and folklore, and between the cosmic and daily life. From my understanding, the Shedim aren't merely evil beings out there. In Jewish literature, they seem to become part of this invisible ecology. They crowd ruins and lurk around bathrooms. They bother scholars, newlyweds, infants, drinkers, even kings. They can be ridiculous, but then they can also be lethal at times. I mean, some of the times, they seem to act like vermin, but other times it's like they're a rebel intelligence that just has its own agenda. And for anyone who has been listening to this series, the fairies, Mothman, daimons, you can probably already sense the family resemblance. Remember, not equivalence. We're only going for family resemblance here. The world keeps producing reports, stories, and systems about liminal intelligences. Beings near but not identical to us. Beings that are attached to place, night, mood, weather sometimes, destiny, and so much else. The Shedim are one Jewish expression of that wider human problem. What do you call the intelligence that seems to press against our world from just outside of perception? So let's begin where we have to begin, with the word itself. Obviously, I don't speak Hebrew, but in Hebrew, the singular is... Now, I don't speak Hebrew, but I think the singular form of the word is shed, and the plural is shedim. And the first thing to say, maybe the most important, is that the Hebrew Bible names them explicitly only twice. That's very important here, because it means we're not dealing with biblical demonology that shows up with everything figured out. We're dealing with a sparse biblical word that later Jewish tradition builds out into a far larger and more crowded world. The two key verses are Deuteronomy 32:17. They sacrifice to demons, not God, and Psalm 106:37. They sacrifice their sons and daughters to the demons. In both cases, Shedim appear in the context of illicit sacrifice, covenantal betrayal, and cultic horror. As you heard, the word enters scripture next to foreign worship and blood. That is the original wound around the term. That already tells us something pretty important though. In the Hebrew Bible, the Shedim are not first introduced as a species catalog of goblin things that are like under your bed. They emerge in polemic. They're the beings or the powers or the spiritual realities associated with worship that Israel is forbidden to offer. Biblical discourse is less interested in demon tourism than in covenantal boundary setting. It's saying, those sacrifices are not going where you think they're going. The objects of idolatrous worship are not neutral. Something is there, and it is not the God of Israel. The Greek Septuagint translated Shedim with daimonia, and that translation is very important because once daimonia enters the picture, the later history of demons in Greek, Jewish, and Christian thought gets much noisier and way more entangled. But the biblical Hebrew word resists a simple one-word export. Even older scholarship noticed that in these verses, the Shedim are bound up with the gods of others, rival powers, taboo cults, and destructive worship, but not yet with that fully moralized bureaucracy people often imagine when they hear the English word demons. As for where the word itself comes from, scholars have long suspected a connection to the Akkadian Shidu. The etymology is debated, and I want to keep that debated alive because this is exactly the kind of thing that gets turned into fake certainty online. But the proposed Mesopotamian connection is real and worth taking seriously. In Akkadian usage, cognate terms could refer to spirits that were not simply and only evil. In Mesopotamian religion, related beings could be protective, royal, even guardianly. The giant Lamassu figures associated with Assyrian gateways are connected with protective spirits called Shidu. So if there is a historical relationship here, it is already telling us something pretty subtle. The ancient Near East did not sort the unseen into the clean little bins that later moral systems preferred. The same powers could guard and menace. The same conceptual family could slide from protection to threat, depending on context, cult, and whatever the cosmology of the day was. And that, honestly, is a theme you will hear all night. The farther back you go, the less tidy the categories tend to be. The modern mind seems to want clean folders: angel, demon, ghost, god, hallucination, superstition, metaphor. The old sources do something much less convenient. They let the world stay crowded, super crowded. If the explicit biblical references to Shedim are sparse, the wider biblical environment definitely isn't. Around the Shedim, there is a penumbra, I love that word, of related figures and terms. But Se'erim, goat demons or hairy wilderness beings, Lilith, Azazel, and the unsettling category of Ruah, an evil spirit, as in the Saul narratives. These are not all the same thing. That's crucial, but they do occupy adjacent territory in the map of danger. Leviticus 17:7 warns Israel not to offer sacrifices to goat demons. That's funny considering what's going on now. 2 Chronicles 11:15 says Jeroboam appointed priests for the goat demons and the calves that he had made. Isaiah 13:21 imagines ruined Babylon as a place where goat demons will dance. And Isaiah 34:14 gives us one of the eeriest verses in the whole Bible. Goat demons shall call to each other. There also Lilith shall repose and find a place to rest. That's the whole ecology in 4 lines. Abandoned place, hybrid creatures, night being, rest among the ruins. It's the wilderness becoming animate with presences that are not for ordinary human habitation. And then, of course, there is Azazel in Leviticus 16, the wilderness destination of the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement. Later Jewish tradition often treats Azazel as a demonic or semi-demonic being, and Encyclopedia Britannica summarizes the later legend in exactly those terms: a demon or evil spirit to whom the goat is sent. But even here, the texture and context is important. I hope you understand that the biblical ritual isn't a horror story for entertainment. It's one goat goes for the Lord, the other for Azazel, and the live goat is sent into the wilderness, bearing the sins of the people. And the wilderness, it's not just empty background, it's a charged outside. Lilith is another case where later fame can distort earlier evidence. In the Hebrew Bible, she appears only in that Isaiah 34 passage, in a devastated landscape populated by uncanny creatures. Later Jewish folklore turns Lilith into a major demonic personality, especially around childbirth and sexuality, and Britannica traces her name and personality to Mesopotamian demon traditions. But in biblical context, what matters is that she belongs to the same ruined, nocturnal, threshold-haunting atmosphere as the siren. The point here is not the full later Lilith myth already intact. The point is that the Bible preserves an image bank of wilderness presences and later tradition develops it. Now compare that with the Ruach Ra. Yeah, I figured out how to say that a little bit. The evil spirit that torments Saul in 1 Samuel. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. That is a pretty different theological structure. In Saul's case, the troubling spirit is not introduced as a rival power fed by illicit sacrifice. It is part of divine judgment, part of the terrifying fact that in biblical monotheism, even affliction is not outside God's sovereignty. So already, in the Bible itself, bad spirit language does not point to one single demon doctrine. It points to a spectrum: foreign cultic powers, wilderness beings, night presences, and spirit affliction under divine permission. This is a good time to slow down. When modern people ask, did ancient Jews believe in demons? The truest answer is, they inherited and preserved a world in which invisible agency was real, but the categories weren't fixed. The categories weren't like fixed. They were mobile and overlapping and layered with history. The Bible might give us vocabulary and scenes, but it doesn't give us the finished rabbinic bestiary. By the Second Temple period, Jewish demonology becomes much more explicit and inventive. This is where the sparse biblical hints get developed into full narrative machinery. Demons receive names, genealogies, roles, and countermeasures. If the Hebrew Bible gives us flashes of a crowded, invisible world, you could say Second Temple literature starts drawing an actual map of this world. A key witness here is Tobit, where Asmodeus enters the story as a named demon. Tobit 3:8 says Sarah had been married several times, and the wicked demon Asmodeus had killed each of them before the marriages could be consummated. This is not yet the Ashmedai of the Talmud with his weird wisdom and dark comedy. Here, Asmodeus is a direct destroyer of marriages and bodies. He is attached to erotic obstruction, jealousy, and death at the threshold of union. And that will matter later, because in later traditions, the danger around newlyweds is still one of the classic demonic pressure points. Then there's 1 Enoch, especially the Book of Watchers. Here, the underlying question is no longer, what are these dangerous powers called? It becomes, where did evil spirits come from? One major Enochic answer is through the fall of the Watchers and the violence of their giant offspring. Enochic and related Second Temple traditions imagine the destruction of the giants, leaving behind spirits that continue to afflict human beings. That is a major expansion of the tradition. It gives demons a myth of origin. It turns the unseen from scattered hostile presences into a continuing afterlife of this kind of primordial corruption. It seems like this is also the point where a necessary distinction has to be made. The Enochic evil spirits of the giants are not the same thing as the biblical Shedim in any simple textual sense. They belong to a later demonological system, but they are part of the same expanding Jewish archive of thinking about malevolent, unseen agency. And if you flatten all of this into one big blob called demons, you lose the history. Biblical Shedim, wilderness Sairim, Azazel traditions, the Enochic spirits of giants, and named figures like Asmodeus all belong to converging but distinctly different strands. The convergence is real, the sameness isn't. The Dead Sea Scrolls show us that this was not merely theoretical. Qumran preserves exorcistic and anti-demonic texts, including material associated with 11Q11 and related compositions, pointing to practical concern with demons and the curtailing of demonic power. In other words, this was not just elite cosmology that was airy and floating. Demonology had ritual consequences. People wrote against demons. They recited against demons. They organized language and knowledge to constrain them. Annette Yoshiko Reed's work is pretty helpful here because she insists that demonology in ancient Judaism was not a sideshow. It was taken seriously as a form of knowledge. Her book basically describes demons and angels as central to this academic enterprise of ordering knowledge about the world. And her conclusion notes that ancient Jewish literature often crosses lines modern people draw way too sharply between natural and supernatural. That is exactly right. For these texts, the unseen is actually part of reality's architecture. And now we're ready for the rabbis, who don't seem to be embarrassed by any of this at all. One of the most unnerving things about rabbinic literature is how casually it discusses terrifying stuff. The Talmud does not always announce, "We now enter the supernatural chapter." It just suddenly starts talking about angels, demons, bathroom etiquette, legal trouble, food, danger after dark. The unseen is just the furniture that all of this stuff sits on. In Haggadah 16a, the rabbis give one of the classic descriptions of demons. In 3 ways, they are like ministering angels. And in 3 ways, they are like humans. The angel-like traits include wings, the ability to move across the world, and superhuman knowledge. The human-like traits include eating and drinking, reproduction, and even death. I think that's a pretty astonishing category, don't you? It means Shedim are neither fully bodiless nor fully embodied in the way we are. They belong to the middle terrain, just like a lot of other things we've been talking about lately. They're alive enough to eat, airy enough to fly, mortal enough to die, and uncanny enough to know way too much. The middle terrain is basically the whole vibe. The Shedim are not just spirits shrouded in a mist of vagueness. Ancient demonology often imagined beings with bodies of some kind. I think that helps explain why rabbinic texts speak so firmly about where Shedim stand, what their feet are like, whether they cast shadows, and what happens if they crowd a room. They don't look at them as an abstraction of evil. It's a thing that has environmental effects. Take Barakot 6a, maybe the most famous dense cluster of demonic material in the Bavli. There, the rabbis say that if the eye had power to see demons, no creature could endure them. They are more numerous than we are. Rav Huna says each person has 1,000 on the left and 10,000 on the right. The text goes on to explain crushed knees, worn clothing, and the jostling of crowded study gatherings as effects of demonic presence. And then it gives one of the great eerie details in all folklore, I think. If you spread fine ashes around your bed, in the morning the demon's footprints will appear like chickens' tracks. This is honestly half horror and half field guide. It's also, to my mind, pretty revealing. Do I say pretty too much? Deeply revealing. How about that? The rabbis imagined the world as densely inhabited by unnoticed pressures, fatigue, crowding, abrasion. These become signatures of invisible traffic. Now, before you get any ideas, the same discussion includes procedures for seeing demons that are dangerous. And one sage who tries is harmed, which is, I have to say, very on brand for old esoteric literature. Here's a forbidden experiment. Don't do it. This guy did it. It went badly. The tradition knows curiosity belongs in the story, but it also makes it clear that curiosity can be expensive. In Barakot 3a, ruins are marked as dangerous, partly because of demons. One should not enter a ruin because of suspicion, structural collapse, and demons. That's like a perfect triad. It doesn't separate practical danger from spiritual danger. They're one and the same. This broken architecture is part of the liminal ecosystem. A ruin is bad because criminals like it, because stones fall, and because unseen things like it too. The rabbis do not force you to choose between realism and enchantment. They allow both. Then come the bathroom demons. Yes, the bathroom demons are real rabbinic material. And yes, they are incredible. Barakot 62a says fear of demons in bathrooms was pervasive enough that Abai's mother raised an animal to accompany him there. Just think about that. A Baraita says modesty in the bathroom saves a person from snakes, scorpions, and demons. Another tradition tells of a particular bathroom in Tiberias where even entering in pairs, even by day, exposed a person to harm from demons. This, I think, is where the Shedim become extremely domestic. They're not some cosmic evil in the Miltonic sky. I like making adjectives out of authors' names. It's fun. I'm not talking about allegorical or abstract metaphysical rebellion. The demon is in the privy. It's in the ruined place. It's in the spot where the body is weak, exposed, and alone. And if you think that sounds too earthy to be theological, I would say the opposite. I think it's clearly theological in a very old way. It says the body is not separate from the sacred. Vulnerability is not spiritually neutral. Architecture, modesty, and impurity all matter because the world is. Guess what word I'm gonna say? Horus. If you expected demonology to stay dramatically cinematic, the Talmud says the danger is actually in the bathroom. Another classic rabbinic trait is that demons do not always stay in the fantasy lane. They show up in legal reasoning. In Gettin 66a, for example, the question arises whether a figure at the bottom of a pit is a man or a demon. The Gemara says demons can appear in human form. Fine. Then how do you tell? Maybe by whether the figure casts a shadow. But demons too can have a shadow. So the answer sharpens further. The real sign is the shadow of a shadow. This is so weirdly precise that I promise you're not going to forget it. It also tells us something very important. The rabbis are not only frightened of demons, they're trying to adjudicate reality in their presence. What counts as proof in a world that is literally haunted? In Pesachim 110a to 112b, demons enter the ordinary ritual social world through the doctrine of zugot. dangerous pairs. Rav Papa reports, in the name of Yosef the demon, if one drinks 2 cups, we demons kill him. If he drinks 4, we do not kill him. Elsewhere in the same cluster, Ashmedai, or Asmodeus as he's known elsewhere, king of the demons, is said to preside over this dangerous domain of pairs. The exact logic can feel hard to understand to modern readers, but the structure is clear enough. Repetition, symmetry, and number can open a door. The wrong pattern in ordinary acts, drinking, travel, bodily habits, exposes a person to invisible harm. I hope you see the arithmetic nature of demonology here. There's also a temporal element. Rabbinic demonology loves dangerous times just as much as dangerous places. Night, noon, transitional hours, moments of bodily weakness, moments of sexual threshold, moments around birth and burial, and those ambiguous edges where categories loosen. This is why Pirkei Avot 5:6 is such a perfect little gem. I don't know if I said that right, by the way. It says that among the strange things created at twilight, on the eve of the first Sabbath, some say there were also the demons. Twilight is the correct birthplace for them. Not full day, not full night. The in-between, the half-formed hour. That's almost too elegant. And then later traditions make the image even more vivid. Demons as these beings whose creation occurred at the edge of Sabbath, and this kind of seam of completion and interruption. Even if you leave aside the later elaborations, the basic symbolic point is, from an academic perspective, gorgeous and unsettling. Demons belong to unfinishedness. They belong to the edge where form almost coheres. They belong to the zone where something can enter because a boundary is neither fully open or fully closed. Just a little gap. If that sounds abstract, let's bring it back down to earth. Ruins, nurseries, weddings, bathrooms. These are all threshold sites, and a threshold demonology is exactly what the sources give us here. If you want the Shedim at their most unforgettable, you have to go to Ashmedai, the rabbinic form of Asmodeus, and the stories around Solomon. Now these do differ to other stories about Solomon, but this is just information. And here the tradition gets kind of insane. It becomes comic, mystical, even a little bit anarchic. Let me try to connect some strands first. In Tobit, Asmodeus is the wicked demon who kills Sarah's husbands. In later Jewish and related traditions, the figure grows larger and stranger. You could summarize the rabbinic legend this way. Solomon captures the demon and compels him into service during the building of the temple. The Jewish encyclopedia preserves the fuller form of the tale, and there it notes that the demon's relation to Solomon and the temple building legends became central to later imagination. So the same named being moves across traditions and seems to change character. In one text, he's murderer of bridegrooms. In another, he's king of demons, trickster, forced laborer, temporary usurper of the throne, and almost, not quite, but almost, this kind of dark, tainted mirror of wisdom itself. The story as the Talmud and later summaries preserve it goes roughly like this. Solomon needs the shamir, the wondrous cutting instrument or creature used to prepare stones for the temple without iron. He interrogates male and female demons who finally direct him toward Ashmedai, king of demons. Ashmedai lives by a well, seals it when he departs, and goes daily to the heavenly and earthly houses of study. That detail alone I think that detail is worth pausing over. The Demon King is connected with the academies. It's kind of funny, but we can see that even the demonic world is not shut out from Torah studies' gravity. Solomon sends Benaiah ben Jehoiada, I think that's how you say it, with a chain and a ring engraved with the divine name, plus wool and wine. Benaiah drains the well, plugs the source, fills it with the wine, and waits. Ashmedai returns, finds the trap, resists, cites scripture against wine, then finally gives in and has a drink. He drinks so much that he falls asleep. Benaiah chains him and captures him under the power of the name. That is classic Jewish magical logic distilled into story. Divine name, cunning, a ritual object, capture by weakness, and mastery by inscription. Then the journey begins, and this is where Ashmedai becomes fascinating. On the road, he performs a series of cryptic actions. He sets a blind man on the right path. He helps a drunkard. He weeps at a wedding procession. He laughs at a man ordering shoes to last 7 years. He laughs at a magician who boasts of hidden knowledge. Later, he explains everything. He sees true conditions rather than appearances. The bridegroom will die soon. The man ordering durable shoes will not own them for 7 days. The magician does not know there is treasure beneath his own feet. In other words, Ashmedai sees through the human theatrical set. This supposed demon king is a revealer of ironic truth. I think this is such a strange and beautiful move, even though we are talking about demons and I'm not a huge fan. I just wanted to make that clear. I'm not team demon. In a lot of traditions, the demon lies. Here too, the demon deceives, but he also seems to diagnose illusion. He becomes the thing that embarrasses human self-certainty. He is dangerous because he has access to hidden realities that human beings do not, which makes him less like a flat cartoon villain and more like one of those old boundary figures or an anti-hero who exposed the ego by humiliating it. A kind of terrible and demonic teacher. A kind of cosmic heckler, I guess. And also, if we're being honest, a character with good podcast energy. Eventually, Solomon, maybe getting too comfortable, asks what makes demons so great if their king can be held in chains by a mortal. Ashmedai says, "Remove the chain, lend me the ring, and I will show you." Solomon agrees. Unwise king move, extremely educational for the rest of us. And the demon responds immediately. With one wing on earth and one touching heaven, he hurls Solomon 400 parasangs away and takes his place. Only later is the impostor discovered, in part through clues about bodily irregularity and in later retellings, the famous motif that demons have chicken feet. Solomon does eventually return and reclaim the throne. We can see this legend is doing a bunch of things at once. It's clearly royal satire, but also warning against hubris. It's a kind of reflection on the danger of controlling powers that one doesn't fully understand. It is also a myth. I think it also comes across as a commentary on wisdom itself. Solomon is wise, yes, but the demon king can still take the ring from him when wisdom becomes vanity. If you've ever wondered why traditions preserve stories in which the learned person is humiliated by the uncanny, this is why. Knowledge does not abolish the abyss. Sometimes it even tempts you closer to it. And notice how different Ashmedai is from a later Christian demon of purely moral temptation. He's still dangerous and still a child of the demonic order, but he's also royal and knowing, and in some scenes almost morally legible in ways that people usually aren't. He weeps where people celebrate and laughs when they boast because he sees what's coming. To me, that doesn't look like simple stock devil kind of behavior. That's the behavior of an uncanny intelligence who lives at least one layer deeper in reality than us. Now we leave the royal court and return to the house, because one of the most important things to understand about Jewish demonology is that it is not confined to these literary flights of imagination. It also appears in material practice. Bowls, amulets, spells, names, protective gestures, inscriptions, and even household ritual. Cambridge's Michael Swartz put this bluntly: no description of Judaism in late antiquity is complete without magic, and the largest corpus of extant Hebrew and Aramaic literary texts physically transcribed between the 3rd and 9th centuries consists of magical writings on amulets and incantation bowls. That's a huge statement. It means demon management was not some kind of fringe hobby. It was part of everyday lived religion. The Aramaic incantation bowls of late antique Mesopotamia are maybe the single most vivid artifacts available in this subject. Penn researchers note that there are an estimated 2,500 such bowls worldwide, with a major collection at Penn. The bowls were inscribed with texts and often images representing demons, clients, and specific requests for protection, counter-curse, healing, or relief. Earlier Penn Museum material explains that bowls were commonly inverted and placed at the corners of a house, so that by sympathetic magic, demons might be trapped or imprisoned. The Kelsey Museum summary says bowls could also be set under thresholds to protect owners from evil spirits and other harmful supernatural beings. So of course, bowls make great decoration, but in this case, they were being used as defensive technology at the threshold. And the inscriptions are really more concrete than you would expect. One Penn bowl from Nippur was prepared to protect named individuals, Abuna Bar Jaripta, his spouse, and children, from evil forces, invoking curses against the attackers and threatening them with Leviathan, Sodom, and Gomorrah. The text is personal. It names the household, it names the danger, and it names the counterforce. That's one of the most anthropologically revealing things in all of this. Demonology is intimate because vulnerability is intimate. The bowl stands exactly where anxiety lives, around the bed, under the house, near the family threshold. This is where I think a modern listener, who else would you be, unless you're a time traveler? Anyway, I think you can feel the continuity. You don't have to believe every ancient cosmological claim in order to recognize what the ritual is for. It is for making the home legible against threat. It's for saying, with object and text, this family is named, this danger is named, and this threshold is protected. Whatever else magic is, it is also concentrated care. Look at Harry Potter. No, I'm just kidding. In that sense, demon bowls are not bizarre relics from a credulous age. They are clear evidence that protective measures needed to be taken. And when we look at the childbirth material, it becomes even clearer. The late antique and later Jewish tradition is full of anxiety around pregnancy, birth, the postpartum period, infants, and nighttime. The vulnerability is biological, of course, social, yes, and also cosmological. The world after dark is imagined as contested, and mothers with newborns are too close to the border. In Jewish tradition, Lilith rules the night, especially for mothers and babies, with particular danger concentrated in the early days after birth. The Jewish Women's Archive preserves examples of amulets made to protect pregnant women and newborn children from Lilith's power. And encyclopedia summaries I found of later amulets describe formulas that narrate Elijah's encounter with Lilith and force her to disclose the angelic names that can ward her off. And what sounded like a random superstition when I started is clearly a system of infant and maternal protection built around a named threat, a vulnerability window, and a simple ritual answer. Now, because I try to be careful, let's keep the distinctions clear. A dybbuk, for example, is not the same as a shed. Britannica defines a dybbuk as a disembodied human spirit, especially a later Eastern European possession phenomenon. Lilith, meanwhile, is a particular demonic female figure of Jewish folklore. The Shedim are broader, so when we talk about childbirth amulets and Lilith, we are talking about overlapping zones of Jewish demonology and folklore, not about one simple interchangeable creature with different hats. Later Jewish mystical and magical traditions, including Kabbalistic ones, elaborate the demonic side of reality even further, especially around figures like Samael and Lilith. In the Middle Ages, there was an emergence of elaborate rituals for gathering demons to a single place, showing that medieval Jewish magic didn't just defend against demons. In some strands, it sought to compel or even manage them through some technique. That is another recurring pattern in human esotericism. First warding, then naming, then bargaining, then attempting mastery, and then usually a story warning you not to get too cocky. I think Solomon would like a word. At this point, it would probably be useful to stop and simply ask the question straight. What are Shedim in rabbinic imagination? Are they fallen angels? Are they pagan gods? Are they merely dead spirits? Or literary metaphors? They seem to be a category of intermediate, dangerous, embodied and not embodied beings within a porous universe. They inhabit margins and weak points. They can pass as human. They can eat, fly, reproduce, die, crowd, deceive, injure, and sometimes speak with unnerving accuracy. They're not the main metaphysical enemy in a total dualist universe. Judaism doesn't become Zoroastrianism here, but they're definitely not harmless symbols. They're real enough inside the literature to require practical response. That last point is worth stressing. Jewish demonology is often less obsessed with the metaphysics of absolute evil than later Christian demonology became. You can see the difference in the categories. Christian demon tradition, especially in the latter and medieval forms, often emphasizes fallen angels, rebellion, temptation, and moral corruption in what to me is a pretty strongly polarized framework. This is the tradition in which devils tempt humans and cause calamities. Rabbinic literature can include moral danger too, but it also gives you demons as pests, night hazards, architectural squatters, imposters, reproductive threats, and sometimes weirdly knowledgeable tricksters. It's pretty messy, and the mess is part of the point. When later traditions make demons entirely, uniformly, metaphysically evil, they become easier to categorize and harder to imagine. The Shedim remain imaginative because they behave like contents of a world that still has some wilderness in it. I guess this is a good place to bring in the comparison piece, but carefully, because comparisons can illuminate and also vandalize. So let's say it clearly. What follows is me talking about family resemblance language, not equating anything. Let's start with the Greek daimon. In Greek religion, a daimon could mean a supernatural power, or even a personal force connected to fate, not just an evil spirit. The broader religious category of angel and demon in world traditions concerns beings that mediate between transcendent and temporal realms. That's one reason the daimon is useful as a comparison point. Like the Shedim, a daimon can inhabit the space between God and human. But the difference matters too. The Greek daimon emerges inside a different cosmology and morality. Shedim are not just Greek daimons with Hebrew labels slapped on top. They belong to Israelite, Jewish, and later rabbinic debates about monotheism, idolatry, danger, and holiness. Then, of course, the jinn. Jinn are beings of smokeless flame, unseen by humans, and the Quranic language says they were created from a smokeless flame of fire. Here, the family resemblance is strong at the level of ontology and social imagination. Unseen, intelligent, near human in some ways, not reducible to mere metaphor, capable of interaction with people, and embedded in a moral religious world that assumes invisible agency is absolutely real. Modern scholarship on mental health and jinn attribution also shows how deeply these beings still function as ways we explain life. But again, distinction is important here. Jinn belong to an Islamic cosmology with their own scriptural grounding. They're not the same thing as Shedim. In the comparative, they're maybe cousins in this bizarre comparative anthropology of the unseen. And I just did a whole episode on this, but of course they're the fairies. Britannica defines fairies as mythical beings in close relationship with humans, and the brownie tradition gives us house-inhabiting, rarely seen, nocturnal folk beings who can help, annoy, or unsettle domestic life. This is where the comparison becomes unexpectedly strong. Fairies in older folklore, like I've said before, are not Disney. These are the entities who live on the threshold. They're near the house, barn, childbirth, roads, places where things feel a little thin, places where things feel a little different. They can bless, mislead, or even abduct. That is absolutely a family resemblance with Shedim. The difference is that fairy traditions emerge from European folk complexes with different relations to Christianity, land, ancestry, and the dead. But the overlap on the functional level, like liminally, locally, interactively, it's striking. I hope you see it too. And then of course, how could I leave out Christian demons, though they deserve their own video? The resemblance is obvious, and the distinction is, kind of, in some ways, more important. Christianity inherited Jewish demon language, but it increasingly moralized and, I know I make words up, but angelologized demonic beings into a more polarized system of these devils, fallen angels, temptation, and spiritual warfare. That system can still preserve older weirdness around named demons like Asmodeus, but on the whole, it sorts the unseen more sharply into camps of God and anti-God, good and evil. Jewish sources are a little more ambiguous. The Shedim are dangerous, yes, but they are often treated as one class of beings within a broader selection, rather than the singular embodiment of some kind of absolute metaphysical rebellion, like Satan or demons. In Christian terms, the demon wants your soul. In rabbinic terms, the demon might also just want your bathroom or your wife. That may sound funny, but it changes the atmosphere completely. It means Jewish demonology is often more ecological than apocalyptic. I should probably stop talking, but let's just talk about modern weirdness just a bit. In contemporary UFO and non-human intelligence discourse, There is a recurring attempt to describe encounter without collapsing it into one explanation. And that move is already interesting. It tells you that the category problem is back. People are again looking for a word that is wide enough to include intelligence, presence, agency, and intrusion without prematurely saying angel, alien, ghost, or demon. Jacques Vallée, who I mention a lot, has spent decades arguing that UFO encounters show continuity with older folklore rather than belonging neatly to a simple extraterrestrial narrative. Whether or not you buy Vallée's conclusions, the comparison is useful. In modern reports, as in fairy lore and ancient demonology, the beings can appear absurd, manipulative, tricksterish, hypnotic, and emotionally disproportionate. Messages can be bizarre. Encounters cluster around odd states, lonely roads, bedrooms, and weird moods. Again, I hope you see the family resemblance. So when I connect Shedim to modern NHI discourse, I'm not saying the rabbis were doing ufology in Aramaic. I'm just saying human cultures repeatedly generate frameworks for uncanny intelligence encounters. And those frameworks often seem to converge around the same motifs: liminality, paralysis, absurdity, intrusion, and this overwhelming sense that the intelligence involved is close enough to touch your life, but difficult to place in your ontology. I'll tell you what ancient Jews called one part of that problem: Shedim. Now we come to the section where a lot of people tense up, because this is where modern explanation can easily become rude. You don't want to do the smug reductionist thing where you walk into an ancient tradition with a flashlight and say, aha, it was sleep paralysis and anxiety. That's self-flattery. But you also don't want to pretend that the human nervous system is irrelevant. So I think the right move is neither debunking nor credulity. It's a layered explanation. Take sleep paralysis. Medical reviews describe it as a state of transient immobility, often with a terrifying sensed presence, fear, and vivid perceptual anomalies. Cross-cultural research shows it is frequently interpreted through the local supernatural imagination. One modern review specifically notes cultural forms like Turkish karabasan, the nighttime pressing entity. That matters because many old reports of nighttime attack, smothering presence, chest pressure, and room-haunting intelligences can cluster around a human experience that is physiologically real and, as an experience, overwhelming. The physiology does not cancel the meaning. It just gives you one layer of the event. The culture then gives it face, name, and a narrative. And what about voice hearing? Contemporary research shows that voice hearing exists on a continuum and is not confined to psychosis. Studies of non-clinical and spiritual voice hearers suggest that interpretation, control, meaning, and your relationship to the voice affect distress levels dramatically. That is very relevant to demonological traditions. An intrusive, accusing, or commanding inner event can be construed as pathology, revelation, temptation, maybe an ancestor, a demon, or alien, depending on the surrounding symbolic system. Again, the modern psychological frame is useful here, but it is not a master key that makes all the older explanations childish. I think we can look at it as a reminder that human beings encounter mind and world through models, and the models are important. Why not just talk about intrusive thoughts too, since I've had so many while recording this? The NIMH defines obsessions as repeated, unwanted, intrusive thoughts, urges, or mental images. And classic non-clinical research found that more than 80% of normal subjects report obsession-like intrusive thoughts. That is hugely important for any spiritual tradition dealing with temptation, blasphemous thoughts, sexual panic, or the sensation that a thought has entered the mind from elsewhere. One thing rabbinic demonology may be doing, at least in part, is giving hostile mental content an ontology that's outside of just ourselves. That can be burdensome, but it can also be relieving. If the thought is an attack and not your identity, different ritual and ethical responses become possible. There is cross-cultural psychiatric work on jinn attribution that makes this even clearer. I've mentioned this already, but scholars note that jinn can function as a cultural explanation for hallucinations and a lot of other mental health problems. And the best clinical guidance emphasizes respectful engagement rather than dismissal. Belief is spiritually meaningful and can be clinically significant at the same time. And we can carry that insight back into the study of Shedim. A person can inhabit a demonological world in a way that organizes suffering, locates responsibility, and even mobilizes communal care. Whether the clinician privately uses different vocabulary isn't the whole story. Anthropologically, I really should stop talking, but anthropologically, what fascinates me is the role of ritual containment. Spread ashes, avoid ruins, do not go alone, guard the nursery, mark the threshold, write the name. There's so many of these practices that take diffuse danger and make it actionable. They turn anxiety into this kind of procedure. But again, that doesn't prove the danger was unreal. Human beings do this in every domain. We ritualize contagion, grief, trauma, even uncertainty. Demonology simply concentrates that process around unseen agency. For example, if the house feels vulnerable, the tradition answers with an object under the floor and a name against the dark. And honestly, maybe that's why these traditions last. Because even in a secular age, people still feel what the old texts took for granted. The house isn't always quiet, just because it's empty. So let's close this thing the way I like to close things, with a pattern. In the Mothman episode, we were dealing with omen and crisis and the intelligence that appears near rupture. In the fairies episode, we were dealing with threshold beings attached to a place and the danger of stepping sideways outside of consensus reality. In the daimons episode, we were dealing with intermediary intelligences, moral, personal, psychological, that distribute fate and meaning without fitting neatly into modern categories. And now with the Shedim, we are watching Jewish tradition localize the same broader human mystery inside its own sacred history, legal world, and idea of domestic life. Mothman is the uncanny at the civic edge. Fairies are the uncanny at the landscape edge. Daimons are the uncanny at the philosophical and personal edge. Shedim are the uncanny at the household, ritual, and rabbinic edge. That is oversimplified, sure, but it is useful, because across all these cases, you keep finding the same grammar. There's a boundary, and it's thinner than people think. Something lives near it, and human beings make stories and rituals to survive contact. The Shedim are, in that case, intensely Jewish beings. They live in a world of halakhic attention and practical holiness. They're not imported movie devils. They're the inhabitants of a world with one God, but a crowded atmosphere. And maybe that's the deepest lesson here. Monotheism did not necessarily empty the cosmos, at least not right away. In Jewish sources, insisting on one God often sharpened the problem of every other lesser agency. What are all these other presences? Foreign gods, demons, spirits, parasites, leftover powers from older worlds? The answer over all these centuries was not singular, which is probably exactly why we're still talking about it today. So if you ask me, what are the Shedim? I think the most faithful answer would probably go something like this. Shedim are one of Judaism's names for invisible, dangerous, semi-intermediate agency, a category born in biblical polemic, thickened in the Second Temple, then dramatized in rabbinic storytelling, and finally domesticated in magic and folklore. And if you ask me if they're real, then I think the old sources would push back with another question. Real in what register? Textual, ritual, social, ontological? And if you ask me what I personally find most haunting, it's not even the huge stuff. It's not Solomon getting flung across the world by a demon king with sky-length wings, though to be fair, that is excellent material. It's the tiny stuff. The ash around the bed, the chicken tracks in the morning, the lamb brought to the bathroom, the mother and newborn under watch. That is where the tradition feels closest to the bone. The Shedim aren't just monsters in epic time. Even now, in a world that explains so much and still can't explain enough, people know the feeling. The hallway at 3 a.m., the wrong pressure in the room, the thought that arrives feeling foreign, that sense of presence beside the bed, the fear that some thresholds have to be crossed carefully. Older Jewish tradition didn't dismiss those feelings, it just named and argued over them. It ended up ritualizing them and putting them into law books, legends, and blessings. And in doing so, it left us one of the richest demonologies on earth. Not because it's the most sensational, but because it tells you how to deal with the demon in the bathroom. So maybe the final image for tonight isn't a horned monster. Maybe it's a house. Your house. Dark outside. Most of the lights off. Everyone's asleep. The threshold is marked. And you're just inside, trying to keep the known world intact. And just beyond your little circle of care, a crowded unseen is waiting to be named. And for the love of all that is holy, maybe do not go exploring for chicken footprints in the bedroom ash. Ever, please. Never do that.